We are live again on Syriana analysis. Thank you guys for joining me tonight. I'm today with Elijah Magnier. You are a veteran war correspondent and senior political risk analyst with over 32 years of experience. You covered a lot of wars, including in the Middle East and broader geopolitical conflicts. I'm very happy to have you on Syriana analysis, and I'm sure the audience are excited to listen to your insights on a very important topic, which is the Germany's decision to send Leopard tanks to Ukraine. And to be honest with you, Elijah, I'm living in Germany since 7 years now, and I haven't seen the German people as active as they are now in terms of politics. Everybody is speaking about this case, whether they are with or against. And I've seen a lots of Germans who were silent in the past year after the war on the offensive on Ukraine, and now they are actively participating in the discussion online. So we will discuss this. I'm very happy to have you. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. Guys, before we start this discussion, the Twitter account of Elijah is in the description below and also his blog. He also publishes in different languages. You can go and check his work. He has, as I mentioned, a very long experience, and at least you can get a military perspective from a person who knows what is he talking about, compared to the, I always call them the armchair experts who are giving opinions about war affairs nowadays. Elijah, I would say after months of debate, especially here in Germany, in the media, and among the politicians, but also pressure from Washington, Berlin accepted finally to send Leopard tanks to Ukraine. Now, some analysts here in Germany they say that the decision will escalate the proxy war in Ukraine. Others say no, and they believe that only such type of weaponry, for example, combat tanks, will deter Russia and hence stop the war or force Putin to the negotiating table. In your opinion, which scenario is more likely to happen in the next few weeks or months?
First of all, let us take what the Americans are saying, and some of what they are saying is correct. For example, the chief of staff, General Milley, said the other day from Ramstein that Russia is not going to be defeated and that Ukraine is most unlikely to recover any territory this year. Therefore, for him, the war is going to last much more than a year. Secondly, so far, Ukraine has lost around 100,000 square kilometers. And when the head of the US military is saying that Ukraine is not going to liberate any of its territory, it means he is aware what Ukraine is in need of and what Ukraine is going to get, because the head of the Ukrainian military already said that he needs 300 tanks and 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicle and 500 howitzers. Therefore, America knows more or less what kind of weapon the Ukrainians are going to get. And in consequences, the sending weapons and sending tanks to Ukraine in the next 2 months, because they need to be trained, is only a way for the war to last longer.
Hmm.
Now, the critical part is what kind of ammunition they're going to send with these tanks. So the tanks will serve only for the war to last longer, but not to recover territory, because there are mobilization on both sides, and Russia, as Joseph Borrell said in several occasions, is not going to lose. So if we know that Russia is not going to lose, it means what we are doing is we are asking the Ukrainians to kill themselves and to offer more sacrifices for this war to last longer. So the tanks, we have seen the Leopard 2 tanks in Syria. how in one day ISIS, with such a little experience in warfare, destroyed seven in one day. And we have seen how the Abrams 1 M in Iraq is being destroyed by Al Qaeda. Therefore, relying on new tanks or new weapons that are going to be sent to Ukraine do not serve the purpose of winning the war or defeating Russia.
But I will share now a tweet of Sevim Dagdelen, and she's a member of parliament here in Germany. And today she said to the Tagesschau that she, of course, opposes the sending of the tanks, but she says battle tanks today, combat aircraft tomorrow, ballistic missiles, and then later our own troops. We must get away from the arms supply bidding war. We need a major diplomatic effort aimed at stopping the war. Now, do you think the delivery of the tanks from the German side will open the door for more dangerous or more escalatory weapons, as the member of the parliament is concerned about? Because this could be like the beginning of a more sophisticated weapon supply to Ukraine, because the Ukrainian side, whether the Americans agree with them or not, but they are repeating day and night that they're gonna defeat Russia, whatever that means, and they're gonna restore not only the Donbas region, Mariupol, and these territories that they lost to Russia, but also the peninsula, which is a red line for Russia in this regard. So, do you think this weapon supply will open the door for different other types of weaponry to go to Ukraine?
What we have seen from the Americans is they are, when we talk about the Americans, we talk about NATO, including Europe, because at the end of the day, who would decide is the US, because it is US led NATO at Ramstein in Germany. This is where the main headquarters and where all the military operation in Ukraine is run, and where all the intelligence services are working together to conduct and plan for the battle in Ukraine. So when we're saying the Americans are gradually increasing the number of weapons and the type of weapon they are supplying to Ukraine, it means they are cautious not to anger Russia, that Russia is going to use, for example, depleted uranium used by the Americans in Iraq, for example, or in Afghanistan, where I have seen the effect of these weapons in Fallujah, Ramadi, in different cities in Iraq. And I can tell you that are many generations suffering from cancer and child malform until today. So that is a possibility, because if the Americans want to push Russia against the wall, Russia is not going to lose. Secondly, what we have seen, the way that Russia is conducting the war and taking the four provinces, two in Donbass and Zaporozhye and Kherson, is to create a kind of a buffer zone of 70 to 80 kilometers deep and 900 kilometers long to protect Crimea, and also to protect the Russian speakers in Donbass that were killed in 2014, where we have seen that according to all the reports that coming from mainstream media, between 13,000 to 14,000 Ukrainians have been killed by the forces of Kiev. So for that, Russia has made up its mind, is advancing. There are fresh forces that are going to be injected in the battlefield. We hear there are 300,000. Therefore, Russia is still in control. When Russia feels that the situation is going out of control, is going to be much more aggressive. So
Hmm.
the problem with Germany supplying tanks to Ukraine has another dimension. First of all, we've seen how Germany was independent at the beginning of the war, saying, I can't impose sanctions on Russia because I need the gas. And by the way, until today, Germany and other European states are still supplied by 3 to 4 billion cubic meters of gas to the continent, because we still get around 7 to 8% of what we need of gas per year, which is around 150 billion cubic meters. And if Russia decides to cut the gas on Germany, we will see the migration of the German industry, as we see already the French and the Spaniard and other countries migrating to the United States, where now the gas and the energy is much cheaper and is available because we are here in Europe buying the energy from the United States 4 to 10 times more expensive than what we used to buy it from Russia, and we used to buy it with 30% discount from Russia. So
Mhm.
we are really paying a large amount here. Now,
Elijah,
migration, this migration is devastating on the German economy as well on the European economy because Europe relies mainly on Germany and France to create a balance with all the other 25 EU nations. The other thing is the sending German tanks to Russia. Now that is related um, a little bit to the burden that the Germans bear as a consequences of the Second World War, the Guild Generation, and how they can feel about having German tanks attacking Russian soldiers. Now, Germany obviously resisted because Germany understands the problem behind it that is much more than sending a dozen or 2 dozen of tanks per year, but it is the how deep Germany is involved and how useful and game changer are these tanks. Because they not, then we understand that Germany is under great pressure from the US to force it to send tanks because we heard Biden today saying, well, we are sending 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine. Now, the total of 31 Abrams tanks and 14 Challenger from the UK and perhaps 25 or 30 between Poland and Germany are not going to do anything really.
I mean, these numbers are not comparable with the number of the tanks that Russia acquires, and they are with thousands. And the production capacity of Russia is also of it's very high, and they are able to reproduce this type of tanks. Now, you mentioned that, which is very correct. NATO, the United States leads NATO. But it seemed to me in the past few weeks that Olaf Scholz was at least trying to put some conditions before he agrees on sending the tanks. He was telling the United States, if you send your tanks, I would also send tanks to Ukraine. Is it safe to say that Scholz has taken the decision in the context of not bearing the risks alone, but keep the USA on board in the event of escalation in Ukraine?
Well, there is something much more serious now than what Scholz thinks or believes. We have life from the German foreign minister saying we are at war with Russia.
Mhm.
Now, hearing Germany at the mouth of its head of diplomacy declaring war on Russia because she said we are at war on Russia. That these are her words. It means Germany is at war at Russia against Russia. Germany has declared war on Russia. There is nothing more clear than that. And that means a huge implication for Germany because Russia is going to behave with Germany as a country at war with it and is going to make everything to weaken Germany or to attack Germany in one way or another. We're not talking about the military attack, but we're talking about countries can hurt each other.
Yes.
And for now, Russia has natural resources and has huge natural resources that the world wants. At least Russia can live with. It has oil and gas that is selling to China, to India, to other countries in Asia. And it's surviving because we have seen what the Americans have promised their European allies at the beginning of the war that Russia is going to be destroyed or the Russian economy is going to be totally crippled. Now, this is not happening. and is not going to happen in the next month or in the course of 2023. Therefore, now we have to see what is going to be the Russian reaction, and I think there is going to be serious escalation because the government of Schulz bears the consequences from saying, I don't want to cut the Russian gas, to hear Biden declaring from the White House. It didn't come from Berlin. The announcement came from the White House that the mainstream 2 is going to stop, to be suspended, and then it has been sabotaged. And according to European intelligence service, is not Russia. So if it is not Russia, so who benefit from it? So
Mhm.
we understand that the Americans cut the road on Europe, not only Germany, but on Europe on the whole, not to fall back to the Russian gas and say, okay, we want it again, because Russia said, you don't need to be friends, we don't need to be allies, but I can supply you with gas. This is why Russia said, well, if you don't want it directly from me, and as you are buying it from India, which is the same Russian gas, you can buy it from Turkey, and I'm going to supply Turkey with additional gas. So we are really making fun of ourselves here.
It's a big circus, in my opinion. I just want to play what Annalena Baerbock said today in this regard that you already mentioned, which I think is a very dangerous statement, especially also you mentioned it's coming from the head of the diplomacy in Germany. And to be honest, I'm not sure yet if she's going to swallow her words tomorrow, because the last time she said she's going to support Ukraine, whether the people who voted for her to be in office agree with her or not. So she doesn't care if those who put her in office agree with her or not. She wants to send more weapons to Ukraine. And the second day, she started to change her statement once again. And now we have this statement I'm going to play. And I'm not sure if she's going to swallow this tomorrow and say, oh, sorry, English is not my first language and I made a mistake. Let's check.
And therefore, I've said already in the last days, yes, we have to do more to defend Ukraine. Yes, we have to do more also on tanks. But the most important and the crucial part is that we do it together and that we do not do the blame game in Europe, because we are fighting a war against Russia and not against each other. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is this a slip from her, like like a tongue slip, or she really meant what she said here? Because this is a declaration of war.
She said the reality. Because when you start sending weapons, you train 10,000 Ukrainian army in Germany every few months, in the UK, and then you train the Ukrainian army on your weapons, and then you have the base in Ramstein, and this is where you conduct the operation. You are at war with. And what she's saying is, we as Europe, because she's right, NATO is at war with Russia. NATO said at the mouth of its Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, that we are not going to lose, that we have to fight Russia, we have to supply Ukraine with weapons. So we only count on the patience of President Vladimir Putin not to take it seriously and pretend that this is already happening on a small scale. And again, I repeat, the Americans are playing a very clever game by not supplying huge amount of weapons, but not putting all their weight in the battlefield. And then they will fall into what Medvedev said, a nuclear country cannot lose
Mm.
if it is facing NATO. Now, serious here. Russian as a classical army cannot face NATO, and Russia as a classical army is not going to fight against all the 20 or the 30 NATO countries and armies together. This is why nuclear weapons exist, because they offer deterrence against the enemy. But so far, Russia has not been pushed in a corner to use its nuclear weapons. Therefore, for the moment, things are still under control. The classical armies are fighting against each other, and they are advancing very slowly in the battlefield. So, in my opinion, things are still under control.
Mhm. Today I was reading a report in an American website called the Breaking Defense. It is they address military affairs, and it says Ukrainian troops could fight with Leopard 2s by early spring. And they mention new training programs in Poland could get some Ukrainian soldiers ready to operate Leopard 2 main battle tanks in combat in as few as 6 weeks, experts told Breaking Defense. Although officers and maintenance specialists would take longer, the tanks themselves could be another story. Is this a realistic time frame in your opinion, 6 weeks? Because I heard um, uh, the training sometimes takes up to a few years, to between 6 months to 3 years. We're talking about 6 weeks here. We're talking about next spring when Russia is preparing its next offensive, the larger offensive on Ukraine.
Well, that reminds me of the country in the Middle East and Africa, really. During my work, that pilots are trained to in the air to shoot against the enemy because they don't know how to land the plane. So they just don't need to return the plane back to the base. So yes, it is possible to train the Ukrainian during 6 to 8 weeks, and that will take us to around the beginning of the spring, 19th to the 20th of March, and then tell them how to use the tanks and then send them to the battlefield, because the Ukrainians already told us that they are ready to fight and die for the cause of the American hegemony. So
Yep.
it doesn't matter if what Ursula von der Leyen said, there are 100,000 Ukrainians killed, which means there are around 400,000 wounded, because if they are an extra 5,000 or 10,000 or 20,000, the Ukrainians have decided to go into this war and then invest everything they have, because we want to join the EU, we want to join NATO, Russia is our enemy, and Russia understood a bit late that Ukraine is an enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Now giving tanks without a proper use, but how to shoot when you have another tank in front of you, because you don't have only tanks moving in the battlefield. You have force, you have one of the best and the finest Israeli tanks in the world, and that was in 2006 using the Russian Kornet. So you can be sure that there will be anti-tank missiles, laser-guided missiles deployed in the battlefield, and then these tanks, the few dozen tanks, are really not going to make a lot of difference if the Ukrainians are well trained or mediocrely trained on the use of these tanks.
Mhm. You mentioned the Merkava, and this was already my next question. Judging from the experience of the Russian forces with the Leopard tanks in Syria, we know that Turkey used these Leopard tanks during the military hostilities in northern Hama and southern Idlib when the Syrian army was trying to liberate the M5 highway, and their pictures of Leopard tanks are being completely destroyed and dismantled. So I'm not a military expert here, but in your opinion, were those the Cornet rockets, or they were the Air Force who were hammering these tanks?
No, they and they use other laser-guided missile. Now, people who will argue that this is not the new Leopard generation, because there are Leopard 2S and Leopard 2A, and there are different kind of more modern German tanks. However, no tank is protected against the laser-guided missile that is recently used in the market, and it is used in the battlefield. As you rightly mentioned, 2018, there was a massacre of the Leopard 2 in the battle against Turkey. So, and we have seen the Merkava is superior than the Leopard 2, and it was also destroyed. So you need really a battalion to destroy several tanks in one day. Now, that is also known, but you have also protection of these tanks, and you need to push the infantry to make sure that you are not an easy target. We have to see how, on which front these tanks will be used.
I will play a video from 2015, a year after the coup d'etat in Kiev that the United States engineered there. Distinguished research professor Michael Hudson from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, he said the following. I want to ask for your opinion about it, your take. Let's take a look together.
What Brzezinski wrote was that America's faced with a possibility of not being able to rule the world unilaterally. And that would be a disaster for democracy. That we can't let any country's economic ability to be self-sufficient means potential military power. And in order to prevent any country from threatening America militarily, you have to prevent it from developing economically. The American nightmare, Brzezinski wrote, was that Russia would get together with Germany and with Western Europe, creating Russian raw materials, German industry, and somehow, finally, Russia would become Westernized. America, under Brzezinski's strategy, said this would be a disaster because if Russia's Westernized, if it becomes democratic, if Europe and Russia are prosperous, then we cannot control them anymore, and they will have no reason to be NATO. We've got to stop Russia, and the place to stop this Russian-European conglomeration is to split it right at the border down Ukraine. Let's do in Ukraine what we did in Afghanistan. Let's back the crazies. Well, most of them are the former neo-Nazi groups that have been so prominent that fly the Nazi flags.
Can we apply this analysis on the current situation now in Ukraine, especially taking into consideration that it was the United States who pressured Germany to join this battle against, or to let's be honest, we are coming closer to direct confrontation with Russia. Can we really apply this analysis on the current situation, in your opinion?
Well, there are 2 points here. First of all, yes, there is a lot of truth in what Brzezinski said. We remember President Emmanuel Macron in 2018 when he said that NATO is a brain dead. And he also said that Europe is in need of an army to protect itself, including from the United States. This is what Macron said in 2018. And what he received a big slap on his hand with this war that he and Germany, France and Germany, felt dragged into, and they didn't want it because, first of all, Russia is in the European continent. Secondly, Russia has lost 24 million people in the Second World War, working with the European against Adolf Hitler. Thirdly, the cooperation between Russia and Europe was at its highest. Europeans were not buying the gas from America and were happy with the Russian gas and were happy with the boom of its industry that was working on the Russian energy that was supplied on a very cheap price. Therefore, Europe was booming, was rich, apart from the fact that Europe had become rich from colonizing other countries, mainly in Africa. But now, before the war, until before February 2022, Europe was a rich continent, and it had its own currency, its unified currency, and that was a kind of a threat to the dollar on a long term. It has its own IBAN. It doesn't need a SWIFT transfer for the financial transactions. So yes, Europe had kind of independency. Now, Donald Trump tried to blackmail Europe, because at the end of the day, Europe needs to sell its products, and the American market is a very attractive market that Europe cannot survive without. So it doesn't mean that Europe is going to go out of his hand, out of the hand of the American control, and that I disagree. On the second point, it is true that Brzezinski said that the Americans, in his interview with Le Nouvel Observatoire in 1991, he said, we offered the Soviet, the Vietnam in Afghanistan. So the Americans, President Carter, sent the CIA to Afghanistan 6 months before the attack of the Soviet Union and the occupation of the Soviet to Afghanistan. However, there is a big difference here. First of all, President Putin, at the beginning of the war, he didn't think that you. So he went to attack and to the control of the capital, and he reached Hostomel, that is 30 kilometers north of Kiev. Secondly, he realized that spreading his forces and trying to put pressure on Kiev, that Kiev is going to fight. This is what he didn't know. So he returned to reduce his plans and his objective to take only the 4 provinces. So by lowering the advantage and the objectives and the expectation and understanding the capability of the Russian army, so he fell back and reduced his objective and his targets. By reducing that, he avoided another Afghanistan in Ukraine. And we see today that he is in control of most of Donbass. So what he needs is only 3 cities to end the war in Donbass and then concentrate more on Zaporozhye and Kherson. Therefore, the objective that he has put a few months ago and renouncing on the first project, even if he did not announce the objective at the first beginning, but we understand from observing the military theater that now he is no longer going to be dragged to a long war, but maybe because there is not going to be a peace agreement, it will be something like Korea, war, no peace. He will create a defense line all along the area that he occupied. Why I said that he wants 70 to 80 kilometers deep buffer zone to protect Crimea, to protect Donbass, and for that he needs to take Zaporozhye and Kherson and the Donbass. And he is not working like in Afghanistan in a hostile society and a hostile environment, because the Afghani fought against him. And he is in an area where the majority are Russian, and those who are Ukrainian and don't want to live under the Russian control, they left already. And Kiev, a long time ago, I heard Zelensky saying, well, we don't want all the people of Donbass, let us go back to Russia. So what Russia did is Russia came to Donbass, and it will leave the protection of Donbass to the Ukrainian Russian speaker, and that is a different scenario from Afghanistan.
This is from the Russian side, and I want to end up this conversation with you with the question, which is, I think, a $1 million question. But how, realistically speaking, how can this conflict end? How can both sides or all sides be convinced that they have to end this war? Is it going to be through diplomacy after this limited escalation, let's say, or we're going to the edge of abyss at the beginning and there would be really danger of nuclear war, and then they would sit on a negotiating table, or maybe even going into World War III?
Only 2 elements can stop this war. First of all, is for the Ukrainian to say, I can no longer fight. When they lose the capability of fighting, they lose enough men and they don't have manpower to put in the battlefield, because equipment, the Americans would always find a way to send them more equipment. But even if they have equipment and they don't have the manpower, this is when the Americans will ask them to stop, to prepare to keep the hostility, but to create a cessation of hostility until the Ukrainian army is rebuilt. The second possibility is only when the Ukrainian manage to gain some territory, because they cannot negotiate from the position of weakness. And President Putin expressed his willingness to talk even today. Even with the status quo, he is ready to sit around the table. But Crimea will not return, Donbass will not return, and the east side of the Dnipro River in Kherson will always remain under his control, and Zaporozhye will always remain under his control because it has a nuclear power, and it also protects the flank of Kherson and Donbass. So only this possibility can stop the war, but it's not going to end, because today we understand that Ukraine and Russia are enemies, and as enemies they can stop fighting, but it doesn't mean they will reach peace.
I think there was a big opportunity for a peace deal before this war, and if the agreements were implemented before this escalation in February 2022, and Russia was ready to give back the Donbass region to Ukraine if there was if Ukrainian government presented certain rights for the Russian-speaking people, more or less a federal system. But now it's not going to happen. After Russia has conquered all these territories and they invested, we're not only talking about financial investment. This is a strategic investment from the Russian side, money-wise, manpower-wise, and also its reputation, and the alliances have changed around the world. So we're moving into a different type of global governance. Let's see what it will look like. It may take a few years, but we're seeing a burst. We are living history, let's
But
say.
there is another important point here, with whom the talks are going to be run. There is
With
no longer
Americans.
trust between Russia and Europe, because Angela Merkel and Hollande, they came out and said, well, wanted to gain more time to give the possibility armed and trained. So the Russian-European trust is gone, it's finished. And there is no longer going to be trust between Russia and Europe, and there is no trust between Russia and the US, because US promised a long time ago, James Baker and Warren Christopher, not to enlarge NATO, and we've seen NATO from 12 to 30 countries, to 30 nations. So the trust doesn't exist. They need to sit down on a piece of paper and write down, because at the end of the day, every war ends around the table. But they both will keep their arms ready, and they both will create a demarcation line where on both sides there will always be a state of no war, no peace, like in Korea.
One of the commentators is asking you a question. In my opinion, he says, a question for the guest: could it be a possibility that Russia takes all of Ukraine? Also, in my opinion, it's no, but
Okay, so that's a very good question, because I'm going to say clearly, this rhetoric and that that Russia is going to occupy the rest of Europe, stop it in Ukraine, it could have been false for simple reason. If we understand that the Russian army is to take Bakhmut today and hasn't reached the city and moving slowly and meter city by city, and then we see fights for several months to occupy one small city, can we imagine taking a hostile like the whole of Ukraine? The amount of resistance that is going to be against the Russian army is going to be tremendous, and there is no main power to occupy Ukraine. So can we imagine going beyond Ukraine to Poland, to Latvia, to other countries, Romania, to Lithuania, to Estonia? It's crazy. All this narrative is so stupid and so naive. If we look at only what the Russian army has done and how it has withdrawn from the surrounding of the capital that is not far from Donbass, we understand that there is no occupation of further for two reasons. One, the Russian army needs to be modernized. Second, Russia is learning a lot out of this war and needs to recover its wound and then reform the whole Russian army. Third, it doesn't have the capability to occupy 650,000 square kilometers that represent Ukraine. And the last point is, we've seen how in Afghanistan, the Soviets have lost because first, they did not inject enough troops. Second, because the society was very hostile against the Soviet. Now, Kiev and all the Ukrainians today cannot stick the Russians. And they will be extremely happy to mount a resistance against them and to kick them out of the country. It's not going to happen.
Elijah Magnier, you are a veteran war correspondent and senior political risk analyst with over 3 decades of experience. You covered the Middle East and broader geopolitical conflicts. I'm very thankful, and I had the honor and the pleasure to have you on Syriana Analysis. I learned from you, and I'm sure the audience appreciate your insight. They were interacting like fire in the live comments. I'm seeing them all the time from here. Guys, the Twitter link of Elijah is in the description below, and also his blog. He publishes regularly on his Twitter account, as of course, but also on his blog in different languages. Go and follow his work, and also try to find the ways to support his work, because it's very important for real military analysts to bring such an insight and content to the general public, because educating the general public is very important, in my opinion. Elijah, thank you very much again. Guys, just before I end up this discussion, since we mentioned Brzezinski and his book, I have put the link of his book in the description below. It's an affiliate, just for you to know. And also there is a book, another book mentioned in the description below. You can also buy these books and read for yourself. And see you hopefully tomorrow. Ciao.